Wir müssen vorwärts! Der Feind wird vernichtet! Sieg oder Tod! Versteht ihr?
The advance must accelerate. We cannot delay. Understood. We will deploy the reserves. Jawohl. The flanks will be secured.
The assessment arrived in German military circles, not as a single pronouncement delivered in a formal briefing, but as the accumulation of a judgment formed through the bitter experience of encountering one American general's operations with a consistency and a frequency that made the conclusion inescapable. Adolf Hitler had spent 3 years on the Western strategic problem with the particular combination of contempt and anxious respect that characterized his understanding of opponents he could not fully dismiss, and by the summer of 1944, his view of the American military had been substantially revised from the confident dismissiveness of his December 1941 declaration of war.
Meine Herren, dieser Plan ist entscheidend für unseren Sieg. Zögers, wir stoßen hier vor und vernichten den Feind. Verstanden? Wir müssen vorstoßen und die feindlichen Gärchen. Hier an dieser Flanke setzen wir unsere ein. Das ist der Schlüssel zum Sieg im Osten.
The Americans had fought in North Africa and Sicily and Italy and had demonstrated qualities, industrial scale, organizational adaptability, the capacity to absorb setbacks and continue, that Hitler had predicted they would not possess. But among the commanders the Americans had produced, one had established himself in German strategic thinking as categorically different from the others, as the expression of a military talent that the Wehrmacht had learned to track with the attention one gives to weather systems that have the capacity to destroy. George Smith Patton Jr. was 58 years old in the summer of 1944, a cavalryman by original training and by deepest temperament who had spent a career preparing for a kind of war that most of his contemporaries believed belonged to a previous century and who had been proved comprehensively right about the nature of armored mobile warfare by the campaigns that had made his reputation.
Gentlemen, the situation demands decisive action. Our forces will advance without delay. We shall prevail! Meine Herren, dieser Plan wird uns den Sieg bringen. Wir müssen vorstoßen, ohne Verzögerung. Die Feinde werden zerschmettert.
He was loud and theatrical, and given to performances of self-confidence so total and so sustained that the boundary between performance and genuine conviction was impossible to locate from the outside, and possibly from the inside as well. He read military history with the intensity of a man who believed that understanding the campaigns of the past was the most direct route to effectiveness in the campaigns of the present. And the commanders he admired most, Napoleon, Rommel, Frederick the great captains of history who had used speed and initiative and the exploitation of the enemy's psychological state as weapons as potent as any material advantage, were the commanders whose instincts his own most closely resembled.
Der Feind wird nicht durchbrechen. Wir verstärken die Ostfront. Luftdruck ist entscheidend. Bereiten Sie alles vor.
Jawohl, mein Führer.
Gut. Die Operation beginnt sofort.
The Germans had first encountered Patton in Tunisia in the spring of 1943 when he had arrived at Second Corps in the aftermath of the Kasserine Pass disaster and had transformed a formation that had been beaten and demoralized into something recognizably dangerous within weeks through a combination of relentless personal pressure, ruthless relief of commanders who did not meet his standards, and the imposition of a discipline so demanding that the soldiers under him alternated between genuine resentment and genuine pride. The German intelligence reports from the Tunisian theater noted the change in American performance that coincided with Patton's assumption of command, noted it with the professional accuracy of a military system that tracked enemy command changes as carefully as it tracked enemy order of battle, and the notation carried the particular quality of attention that experienced soldiers give to opponents who have demonstrated the capacity for rapid improvement. Sicily in July and August of 1943 gave the German High Command its most extended and most alarming view of what Patton's operational method looked like when it was given sufficient resources and sufficient freedom of maneuver. The Sicily campaign was ostensibly a British-American cooperative operation under the command of General Sir Harold Alexander, and the command arrangements assigned the main effort to General Sir Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army, while Patton's 7th Army was given the secondary mission of protecting Montgomery's flank. Patton executed the flank protection mission, and then, with a creative interpretation of his orders that his superiors were still processing when the fait accompli was already accomplished, drove his army in a completely different direction, northwest and then north toward Palermo, and then east along the northern coast toward Messina, the island's northeastern tip, and the prize whose capture would complete the Sicilian campaign. The drive to Palermo covered 170 miles in less than 4 days, a pace that astonished even the officers directing it, and that left the German and Italian forces on the island unable to organize coherent resistance because the speed of the American advance consistently outran the speed of German response. The German 14th Panzer Corps, responsible for the defense of the western portion of the island, found itself reacting to Patton's movements rather than shaping the battle, conducting the kind of defensive improvisation under pressure that German armored forces had spent the war inflicting on others and found deeply uncomfortable when the positions were reversed. General Hans Huber, commanding the corps with the professional skill that had characterized his leadership on the Eastern Front, managed the German withdrawal from Sicily with enough tactical efficiency to evacuate the majority of his force across the Strait of Messina before Patton's army reached the city. But the evacuation was itself an acknowledgement of what Patton's operational tempo had achieved. The German position on the island had been rendered untenable faster than the German command system had believed an American army was capable of making it. The reports that reached German intelligence from Sicily went directly into the assessments that the Wehrmacht's analytical apparatus was constructing of Allied commanders, and the Patton file that emerged from Sicily was one that generated discussion at the highest levels of German command. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had encountered Patton's predecessor and American armored doctrine in North Africa and had developed a professional understanding of American military potential that was more respectful than most of his German contemporaries, read the Sicily reports with the attention of a man who recognized in Patton's operational style the same instincts that had made his own desert campaign effective: the preference for speed over caution, the willingness to exploit success beyond the point where more careful commanders would have consolidated, the understanding that an enemy's psychological dislocation was as important an objective as any physical terrain feature. The slapping incidents that removed Patton from command in Sicily and kept him in professional limbo through the autumn of 1943 and the first half of 1944 were received in German intelligence circles with a satisfaction that was real but appropriately cautious. The German assessors understood that American commanders were relieved and restored with a regularity that reflected the different command culture of an army that had not yet developed the institutional conservatism of a long-established military tradition, and that Patton's removal from field command was more likely to be temporary than permanent, given his evident operational effectiveness. The German monitoring of Allied radio traffic and press reporting through the months of Patton's absence tracked the American general's movements and activities with an attention that belied any German confidence that the Patton problem had been permanently resolved. The deception operation that the Allies constructed around Patton's presence in England in the spring of 1944. Operation Fortitude, the elaborate strategic deception designed to convince the German High Command that the main Allied invasion effort would target the Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy, used Patton as its central instrument because the German assessment of Patton was itself the deception's most important asset. The Allied planners understood that the Germans believed Patton was the most capable American commander and would therefore believe that the most important Allied operation would be entrusted to him. by placing Patton in nominal command of the fictional 1st United States Army Group and feeding the German intelligence apparatus with carefully constructed evidence of that formation's existence and intentions, the Allies exploited the German respect for Patton to anchor the most consequential strategic deception of the war. Hitler's response to the Normandy landings on June 6, 1944, was shaped in part by his belief that the Normandy attack was a diversion and that the main assault was still coming at the Pas de Calais under Patton's command. The Wehrmacht held its panzer reserves back from Normandy for weeks after the landing, waiting for the Patton-led assault that never came, and the waiting gave the Allied beachhead the time it needed to consolidate into a lodgment too strong to be eliminated. The deception worked in large part because the German High Command's assessment of Patton was accurate, because the respect that German intelligence had for his operational capability was genuine and well-founded, and the accuracy of the assessment was the instrument of its exploitation. When Patton was finally committed to the Normandy campaign, given command of the Third Army, and unleashed into the breakout from the Cotentin Peninsula in late July and early August 1944, the German command in the West experienced something that the most alarming pre-invasion intelligence assessments had described, but that experiencing directly was still more disturbing than anticipating abstractly. Operation Cobra, General Omar Bradley's breakout operation, had opened a gap in the German lines, and Patton drove his armored columns through that gap with a speed that the German defensive system could not absorb. The Third Army moved through the Avranches corridor and turned the corner into Brittany and simultaneously drove south into the Maine and eastward across France with a multi-directional exploitation that the German command attempted to track and found impossible to stay ahead of. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, commanding German forces in the West in the critical weeks of the breakout, was receiving reports of Patton's movements that read less like the operational dispatches of a military campaign than like the communications of a natural disaster. Accounts of columns appearing in unexpected locations, of supply lines being cut before defensive positions could be organized, of the particular chaos that attends an armored advance moving faster than the enemy's capacity to respond coherently. Von Kluge had commanded on the Eastern Front and had experienced the full range of Soviet offensive pressure, but what Patton was doing in France in August 1944 was different in quality from Soviet armored operations. Faster, more flexible, more responsive to the ground, driven by a commander whose personal presence at the front was constant and whose ability to alter the direction of the advance in response to opportunity was exercised with a decisiveness that the German command system could not match at the speed Patton was demanding. The Falaise Pocket, which closed in August 1944 and trapped the remnants of two German armies in a killing ground from which most of the men escaped, but virtually all of the equipment did not, was the operational consequence of Patton's drive eastward and northward, converging with the British and Canadian forces pressing southward from the Normandy front. The gap that allowed the majority of the German troops to escape before the pocket fully closed was a source of lasting controversy in Allied command discussions. But for the German military, the Falaise battles were a catastrophe of the first order, the destruction of Army Group B's material strength on a scale that left the Western Front's defensive capacity permanently compromised. Patton's Third Army had driven the southern arm of the encirclement with a speed that had come close to closing the pocket entirely, and the German units that had escaped did so through a corridor that Patton's forces had been pressing to close when the decision to halt was made at levels above his command. Hitler's discussions of Patton in the period following Falaise and the subsequent race across France were conducted in the bunker briefings, with a quality of obsessive attention that distinguished Patton's name from the names of other Allied commanders. The Führer, who had declared war on the United States with confident predictions about American military incapacity, was now directing his intelligence services to track Patton's movements with a priority that reflected genuine strategic anxiety. Because wherever Patton's Third Army appeared on the situation maps, the German defensive situation in that sector deteriorated with a consistency that could not be attributed to coincidence or isolated tactical success. Patton was operational speed made human, the embodiment of the principle that in mobile warfare, tempo is a weapon, and that a commander who maintains higher tempo than his opponent controls the conditions of the battle regardless of the material balance between the two forces. The autumn of 1944 brought the fuel crisis that slowed the Allied advance across France and gave the German defensive position a breathing space it would not otherwise have received. Patton's Third Army, which had been covering ground at rates that seemed to mock the conventional understanding of operational logistics, was stopped not by German resistance, but by the simple absence of fuel to put in the tanks that had been moving faster than the supply system could follow. Patton raged against the supply allocations with the fury of a man who understood that the opportunity presented by the German collapse in France was time-limited, and that every day the advance stopped was a day the German defensive system used to reconstitute itself. He was right. And the German High Command understood that he was right in the same way that a man knows the value of a reprieve, knows it most clearly in the moment of receiving it. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 gave the German High Command a final opportunity to measure the distance between Patton's operational capability and their own, and the measurement was not favorable. The Ardennes offensive had been planned in part around assessments of how quickly the Allied armies could react to the unexpected. Assessments that factored in the command coordination problems and the institutional conservatism that characterized coalition warfare, and that suggested the Germans would have sufficient time to reach the Meuse before a coherent Allied response could be organized. The assessment did not adequately account for what Patton would do when presented with a crisis that his professional instincts told him required immediate and massive response. Patton had been monitoring the German build-up in the Ardennes with a suspicion born of professional intuition before the offensive began. And when the attack struck on December 16th, he was already thinking through the response that the situation would require. Within hours of the German assault, before the full scope of the offensive was clear to most of the Allied command, Patton was on the telephone to his staff ordering the preliminary movement of forces that would be needed for a counterattack from the south. When Eisenhower convened the senior Allied commanders at Verdun on December 19th to discuss the response to the German breakthrough, and asked Patton when he could attack northward toward Bastogne, Patton's answer that he could attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours produced an audible reaction of disbelief in the room that reflected the conventional military wisdom about what was operationally possible. The conventional military wisdom was wrong, and Patton knew it was wrong because he had already begun moving his forces before the question was asked. The 90-degree turn of 3 Army Corps in the middle of an active winter campaign, the reorientation of an entire army's axis of advance from east to west to north in 72 hours, the maintenance of supply and communications through the turn, these were achievements of operational staff work and command pressure that the German planning for the Ardennes offensive had rated as beyond American capability in the time frame that the German advance required. The German assessment had been based on reasonable inference from the organizational demands of the operation. It had not adequately accounted for the fact that Patton had anticipated the need for precisely this kind of turn and had prepared his staff for it before the crisis made it necessary. When Patton's armor broke through to Bastogne on December 26th, relieving the 101st Airborne Division and sealing the strategic failure of the Ardennes offensive in its most visible form, The German High Command received the news with the particular combination of professional respect and personal despair that characterizes the recognition of an opponent who has performed beyond the boundaries of what professional calculation suggested was possible. Model and Rundstedt had known the offensive was failing before Patton's relief of Bastogne confirmed it, but the speed and the decisiveness of the American response, the speed that bore Patton's personal signature as clearly as if he had written his name across the operational map, demonstrated once again that the German assessments of American operational capability in the time-critical dimensions of mobile warfare had consistently underestimated the one American commander who understood those dimensions most completely. Hitler's explicit identification of Patton as the most dangerous enemy the German military faced was not the product of a single briefing or a single observation, but the conclusion that the accumulated evidence of 2 years of operational encounters had made inescapable. The German High Command tracked Allied commanders with professional attention, and the file on Patton that the Wehrmacht's intelligence apparatus had been building since Tunisia contained the record of a consistency of performance, the ability to transform situations, to move faster than opponents expected, to exploit success beyond the point of conventional caution, to impose on the enemy the kind of psychological as well as physical dislocation that made coherent defense impossible, that had no clear equivalent in the Allied order of battle and no comfortable precedent in the German experience of fighting Western opponents. The German generals who discussed Patton in their post-war memoirs and interviews were men who had spent their careers in the most demanding military culture in the world and who applied to Allied commanders the professional standards of an officer corps that had no difficulty with honest assessment of opponents whose performance merited it. Their assessments of Patton were consistent across the individuals who offered them and across the campaigns they drew on for evidence. Rommel's implicit acknowledgement in his tactical writings that Patton had understood the armoured battle in North Africa better than the Americans who had faced him there. Von Klug's reports from the Normandy breakout that described Patton's operational tempo in terms that reflected genuine alarm. Model's recognition in the Ardennes that the counterattack coming from the south bore the operational signature of a commander who had prepared for the contingency before it arose. The assessment that Hitler delivered to his generals that among the enemies Germany faced on the Western Front, Patton was the most dangerous, was, for once in the final years of a regime characterized by the substitution of ideology for honest analysis, simply accurate. It was accurate because it was based on the evidence of what Patton had actually done in the campaigns that the German military had fought against him, and because the German military, whatever its many failures of strategic judgment in the later war, retained at the operational and tactical levels the professional capacity to recognize military excellence in an opponent and to report that recognition with the honesty that self-preservation required. Patton did not win the war in Europe by himself, and the historical record does not support the simplification that reduces the Allied victory to any single commander's contribution. The war was won by the combination of Soviet military power in the East, Allied industrial production on a scale that overwhelmed German capacity, the strategic bombing campaign that destroyed German fuel production and transportation infrastructure, and the coalition of armies that pressed from every direction until the German military system collapsed under the simultaneous weight of pressure it could not relieve. But within the Allied coalition, Patton was the commander who most completely understood and most consistently applied the principle that in mobile warfare, speed is not merely one advantage among many, but the organizing principle around which all other advantages must be arranged. He understood it earlier than most, applied it more consistently than any, and demonstrated through the campaigns of 1943 and 1944 that the understanding consistently applied produced operational results that transformed the conditions of the war faster than any alternative approach available to the Allied armies in the West. Hitler's generals had fought him from Tunisia to the Rhine, and fighting him had taught them what Hitler had recognized in the assessments he received and had stated with the directness that the evidence warranted. Among the enemies Germany faced, Patton was the most dangerous, because Patton was the one who fought in the way that the Wehrmacht had been built to fight, and had used the method against its creators with a mastery that the creators themselves were compelled to acknowledge.